Hello, everyone. I want to start with a quick disclaimer. I'm not here to attack people of faith, and I hope you'll agree with me on this one. What I am saying is that when a government is corrupt, especially one led by someone loudly professing Christian values, it's a poor representation of what Christianity actually stands for. All corruption needs to be called out, regardless of beliefs. And with that out of the way, let's move on to chapter 2, Bethany. Bethany has always been at the centre of things for me. My very oldest memory, dating back to about 1914, when I was 3 years old, is of being taken in a sulky by my mother to see our house in Bethany being built. I can picture her now tying up the horse in front of the house while beyond her there was a workman high up on the rafters of the house laying the corrugated iron roof. I discovered long afterwards that my father borrowed £300 to build the house, which must have been an enormous sum for him then. Our house was built of weatherboards outside and lined with first-class pine inside, and it was bigger than most farmhouses in the Kingaroy area. The ceilings were 11 feet high, and on the hottest day in summer, the house was cool inside. There were verandas on three sides, a hallway running from front to back, two bedrooms, a kitchen, and a study. When I recall my boyhood now, it seems to me that the kitchen was the most important room of all. We talked there, we read books there, and we prayed there. It was a room, naturally enough, which I always associated with my mother. The study was my father's room. My father, Carl Bielke Peterson, was born in Denmark and came to Australia with his parents, sister, and three brothers. He was 22 years old then and had studied at Copenhagen and at Heidelberg. The family settled in Hobart, and father found a job there teaching mathematics at a church school. This suggests to me that he must have had a good command of English even before he arrived. Father was a deeply religious man, and after teaching in Hobart, he went to New Zealand and was ordained a Lutheran minister. He worked for 7 years in New Zealand before moving to Brisbane. The rest of the Bjelke Peterson boys stayed in Tasmania and started a physical culture business, which later expanded to Melbourne and Sydney and as far as I know, is still operating under the family name. Father's only sister, Marie, became an author and wrote many books, most of them romantic novels. I don't suppose anyone reads Aunt Marie's novels now, but in her day they were very popular, and we used to look upon her as a very famous relative. Because father could speak five languages, the church gave him the job of looking after immigrants who had just arrived in Brisbane. In those days, there was a great need for the ministry of this kind, because immigrants used to be offloaded like cargo on the wharf and left to fend for themselves. Father would meet the ships when they arrived and advise people how to find a job and a place to live in Brisbane. He also advised them where to go if they wanted to settle on the land, and one of the farming districts he recommended to Scandinavians and Germans in particular was the South Burnett, 150 miles from Brisbane. Some of the descendants in those immigrants are still there in large numbers today. The Hansons, the Petersons, the Larstons, the Jensens. I think father must have felt personally responsible for those pioneers he sent into the rough scrubland of the South Burnett, because every 6 months or so he travelled up to visit them. It was a long trip in those days. 3 days in a Cobb and Co. coach and two overnight stops at Moore and Nanango. 60 years later, it took me only 40 minutes to make the same journey in my own plane. The settlers had built a shingle roof church and 2.5 miles from what is now Bethany, and father used to stay in the area for a week or more, conducting church services and weddings. It was on one of these visits that he met a Danish-born girl named Marion Poulsen, a farmer's daughter, who was to become my mother. After 6 or 7 years in Queensland, father went back to the North Island of New Zealand to work among the Scandinavian settlers there. Before he left Queensland, though, he had courted Marion Poulsen, and she followed him over to New Zealand. They were married in New Zealand, and their first child, a boy named Christian, was born there. 3 years later, I was born there too, in a town called Danvik, on 13th of January 1911. About this time, my father's health began to break down. He developed a goiter, which in those days was a condition doctors did not really know how to treat, and this, combined with other health problems, compelled him to resign from the ministry. Father earned very little as a pastor, and my parents often had barely enough money to buy food for themselves. Mother always thought that their poor diet was responsible for the breakdown in father's health. Father decided to go farming in New Zealand to try and regain his strength. He borrowed money from his brothers and bought a 1,000-acre sheep farm, but the climate was cold and wet, and after a year his health was no better. There was no alternative for him but to bring us all back to Queensland. I was then 2.5 years old. I'm afraid I have no recollection at all of those early years in New Zealand, or of the voyage home across the Tasman Sea. Back in Queensland, Father decided to buy a farm in the South Burnett district. My mother probably had a lot to do with the decision, for her own family still lived in the area and she could count on them for support in what she must have realised would be pretty tough times ahead. Father bought 100 acres of scrubland about 4 miles from what was then the little township of Kingaroy. The land cost him 2 shillings and sixpence an acre, which at that time was the standard price for virgin scrubland. He named our new home Bethany after the town in the Gospel stories. I don't know for sure why the name was chosen, but Bethany was a place which Jesus often visited and where he seemed to be happy. Father probably hoped we would be happy at Bethany too. We were happy there too, but life was terribly hard. Father was 6 feet tall, solidly built, and as straight as a post, but he was never well enough or strong enough to run the farm, and the burden of the work had to be borne mainly by my mother and later by me. Fortunately, my mother's father and her 2 brothers, both big, strong men, lived only 4 miles from us, and they came over to chop and clear the scrub at Bethany when we arrived. One of Father's brothers, who lived in Sydney, lent the £300 to build our house. Repaying that loan out of our farm's meagre earnings proved to be a long and painful process, but in the end, the loan was repaid. Poor Father. He was never cut out for the tough grind of farm life. He was a city man and an academic through and through. I don't think he was ever happier than when he had his head buried in a book or was working on translating some text from one language to another. I have a clear memory of him when we first moved into the new house at Bethany, unpacking the big crates of books which he had brought with us from New Zealand. There was a mouth organ in one of the crates, and I remember being thrilled when he gave it to me. Those books were terribly important to Father, and he built many bookshelves to store them. Although he encouraged us to read as often as we could, there were many books which we were not allowed to read, for Father insisted we read good books. He did have a big collection of Zane Grey books. I can still see the backs of them in a long, low row on the shelf, and he did let me read those. I suppose this was because there was nothing romantic in them. They were just stories of cowboys hunting Indians, and Indians hunting cowboys. I was fascinated by those Zane Grey books. I particularly admired the stealth and guile of the Indians, and I don't think there was one I did not read several times. Father used to cut articles out of the newspapers and file them in empty shoeboxes he got from a little shoe shop in Kingaroy. He had a separate box for each subject, and eventually there was a big collection of boxes in his study. When I first entered politics, Father helped me prepare my speeches by referring to his shoe boxes of information. My parents always called me by my full Christian name, Johannes, which in the Danish manner they pronounced Johannes. Father insisted that we learn to speak Danish and, what is more, to speak it correctly. He was very proud of his Danish roots and thought we ought to value our Danish heritage too, and would get very angry if we said anything critical about Denmark. I remember at the dinner table once, after he had been talking about Denmark and saying what a wonderful little country it was, I spoke up and said I did not think it was much of a country at all, because we had never learnt anything about Denmark at school. Father jumped up, came around to my side of the table, caught me by the arm and smacked me hard. I'll teach you to talk disrespectfully about dear little Denmark, he said. Being able to speak Danish has come in handy from time to time. Once, when my sister Agneta was living on a cattle property in Western Queensland, she had to share a party line with other people, and all of them could listen in on each other's telephone conversations. You would hear the phone click, and then you would know someone else was on the line. So whenever I phoned Nita, which was nearly every Sunday, we spoke to each other in Danish, which probably made the others on the line all the more curious to know what we were saying. While I was still a small boy, Father went down to Melbourne to have his goiter operated on. I still have a card he sent me while he was there. Something must have gone wrong during the operation. Perhaps a nerve in his neck was cut, because from then on Father's face had a nervous twitch. Father became self-conscious about it. and as time went on, he avoided going out or having to meet people, even friends. Apart from doing a little gardening, he virtually lived in his room, reading and writing and translating. Eventually, he took to having his meals by himself. All this must have been a great hardship for him, coming on top of the other problems in his life, but Father Spirit was never broken and his religious faith was never shaken. He was a disciplinarian of the old school, and he imposed a strict discipline on his children. We always had to sit up straight like little soldiers. Skuldrin tilbaga, which means shoulders back, he would often say to us in Danish as we sat around the table. Father did not smoke or drink himself, and he cautioned us not to drink or smoke either. He used to say to me that he had seen far too many fellows start drinking and not be able to stop. What he said was very true. I can recall some members of Parliament who were virtually teetotalers when they came into the House with me more than 40 years ago, but then began hanging around the bars in the House and ended up ruining their health. Father's message to us was to be strong in discipline and strong in faith. On Sundays, after we came home from church, Father would get me to sit out on the front veranda in a squatter's chair and read books, mainly biographies or inspirational books. We never worked on a Sunday. More than anything, I'm in debt to my father for making me realize there is a spiritual side to life, and that the spiritual side is really more important than the material side. Our religion was the center of our lives, and we prayed as a family every morning. We gathered in the kitchen with our little New Testaments and read a chapter each day. My own children did the same. Father instilled into me a love of the Bible, and for the whole of my life, I've made a point of reading the Bible every day. My parents' greatest gift to me was the gift of faith, for it has been the mainstay of my life. Father's health was always so fragile that we were resigned to the possibility he might die at any time. I will remember one cold, wet night in the early 1930s when Father's doctor summoned me home at 2 o'clock in the morning from a farm 20 miles away, where I'd been doing contract work. There was a bitter westerly wind blowing, and I will never forget riding home on a motorbike in the dark and fearing I would never get to Bethany in time to see my father before he died. Father was alive when I arrived, but the doctor, looking very grave, told me he would not last until the morning. The interesting thing is that the doctor died long before Father did. Father was about 60 then, and he lived another 24 years. I sometimes tell this story to illustrate the fact that life can be full of uncertainties. It was my mother, however, who was the biggest influence on me when I was growing up. She was the cornerstone of the Bjelke-Petersen family. She did the heavy work around the farm, which Father was physically incapable of doing, and she bore the burden cheerfully. Her life was full of hardships and sorrows, but I did not ever hear her complain. She was a strong, brave woman who was sustained by her Christian faith. She accepted every adversity that came along, believing that whatever happened to us at Bethany, no matter how bad it was God's will, and all things work together for good for those who love God. She accepted our successes in the same spirit. Mother lived to see me become Premier of Queensland, but I don't think that for 1 minute she regarded that as an achievement in which she should take personal pride. Instead, she probably thanked God for blessing her son with such a great opportunity and responsibility. As I grew older, I took on more and more of the work on the farm, but in those early years, Mother bore the burden almost single-handedly, as well as running the home. My brother, Christian, was never much of a help around the farm. He took after our father. He wasn't the slightest bit interested in the farm or in sport or in anything else out of doors. For Christian, life's greatest pleasure was sitting with books piled up around him, reading and studying. I used to try to get him to come out and help me on the farm, but he was never interested. Father would say to him, Christian, you'd better go and help Johannes pull the corn. And Christian would have to go, but he would have his eye on his watch and leave the minute he could. He was exceptionally clever at designing things. When he was about 20 years old, he designed an engine with a single crankshaft and opposing pistons and tried to sell the patent to the army, but nobody was interested. It wouldn't work, they said. Years later, the kind of engine Christian designed became the standard engine for light planes. Christian was always studying. He was such a keen student that, although he could hardly have afforded it, my parents sent him down to Brisbane Grammar School. He lived in a boarding house in Brisbane, and perhaps because of the kind of food provided there, he developed stomach ulcers. The doctors tried many things to cure them, but his condition got steadily worse. Even after he arrived, he returned to Bethany. Finally, the doctors in Brisbane decided to operate. I remember hearing at the time that it was a big operation. 4 doctors, I think, worked for 4 hours. The operation was not a success, and Christian grew thinner and thinner. He was 19 at the time of the operation, and he lived for only another 3 years. Afterwards, I often heard it suggested that the surgery had been too drastic. Mother nursed Christian day and night during those last 3 years. She used to keep a fire going right through the night because as Christian grew weaker, he suffered more and more from the cold. The doctors came out to Bethany occasionally to see him, but it seemed they could do nothing for him. He did his best to regain his health. He would go for walks and try to regain his strength, but the ulcers would always end up bleeding. Long before the end, Christian came to realize he was dying, and he was completely resigned to it. He became a wonderful witness for his faith. He got his father to buy a stack of pocket-sized New Testaments, and he signed them and gave them to his friends. He wrote a message in each one, reminding his friends of the true meaning of life and saying he hoped to meet them all in the life that was to come. Many of those friends are themselves dead now, of course. But I would be surprised if there were not a few left in the Kingaroy area who still own the New Testaments Christian gave them all those years ago. Christian often spoke to me about his approaching death and implored me to keep on the straight and narrow. I remember him saying, "Joe, never go over to the world. Never sell your soul for filthy lucre." You see, Christian and I had often talked about ways of escaping from our poverty and had worked out all kinds of schemes for making money. Now, realizing he faced eternity, he was worried he may have led me astray. He said to me earnestly, "Joe, forgive me for ever putting the idea of filthy lucre in your head." Dear Christian, such a short life and yet such a good one. His death was a terrible blow to my parents, particularly my mother, but I think that they sustained by the certainty of their faith that they would meet him again one day in another life. Christian was a close friend of mine as well as being my brother, and I missed him a lot too. I've always wondered what he might have become if he had not been taken so young. He died in 1929, and in that year, Mother and I planted a tree of remembrance for him at Bethany. It was a small hoop pine which he himself had found near the foot of the Bunya Mountains, not far from Bethany. He was clinging by a few roots to the side of a creek bed, and Christian said, "I think we can take this one home. It will only get washed away." So he dug it up, brought it home in a handkerchief, and put it in a tin. It survived and was about 3 feet high when he died, so he planted it in his memory. It's still there, an enormous tree now, standing near the entrance to our home, and not long ago I had a brass plaque attached to it to make sure the next generation knows why it was planted. Christian is buried close to our parents in the cemetery at Tabinga, a village just down the road from Bethany, beneath a gravestone he designed himself. On the stone, above the usual inscription, there is a hand pointing upwards to the gates of heaven, and across the top the words, "Meet me there." Also on the stone are the well-known words recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 57. "Thanks be to God, which giveth us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." I have always considered the gravestone a monument to Christians' courage and faith. Okay, now to summarize some things that I found in that chapter. One thing that stood out here was othering. Joe talks about his early love of cowboy and Native American books, describing the Native Americans as using guile. And I found that interesting word choice. He could have said cunning or clever. Guile has a negative shade, like the difference between calling someone independent or stubborn. And it makes me wonder, did that early framing of us and them carry into his later views on Indigenous Australians? Okay, another thread that I thought interesting was nationalism. So his father was proud of Denmark, and Joe was taught to hold pride in his heritage, which without much room for criticism. And we saw something similar in chapter 1 where he stressed Queenslanders' pride in their state. Does this kind of blind pride shut down critical thinking? And finally, Christian values come up strongly in this chapter, of course. So Joe's brother, Christian, told him, "Never sell your soul for filthy lucre," which is an old biblical word for money. And the irony is hard to miss, I think, given how infamous his government later became for corruption. Right, and that's all for me, folks. I will see you next time for chapter 3, which is Hard Beginnings.